"Get out of my house, you parasite." That's what my husband said to me the night he threw me onto the street like I was nothing. The rain was coming down in sheets, cold and heavy, plastering my hair to my face as if the sky itself wanted to mourn with me. My hands were still holding onto the shirt I had folded for him minutes earlier when the door opened, and he walked in, but he wasn't alone. Cassandra. The woman he'd sworn was just a colleague. She wasn't just younger, she was polished, put together, the kind of woman who wore her confidence like expensive perfume. And speaking of perfume, it hit me before her words did, filling the living room that still smelled of my cooking, as if to announce that she belonged here, in my home. I looked at Adrian, my Adrian, waiting for something, an explanation, a denial, anything. He looked nothing like the man I'd sacrificed 10 years of my life for. His eyes didn't even reach mine. His fingers slipped into hers so easily, and she smiled wickedly at me. His throat tightened, and then the words came. "Lydia, this isn't working anymore. You've been living off me for too long. I can't carry dead weight. You're nothing but a parasite. It's time for you to leave." That word, parasite, hit harder than the rain against my skin. My knees gave out, my breath caught in my throat. A parasite? After I sold my jewelry to pay his first office rent? After I spent sleepless nights crunching numbers so his books would balance? After I worked double shifts to make sure there was food on the table while he chased dreams? Dead weight? My mouth opened, but no sound came. No scream, no plea, just silence. And maybe that silence was louder than anything I could have said, because Cassandra's lips curled into a smile. She looked at me not with pity, but triumph. That was when Adrian reached for the suitcase. My suitcase, already packed, already waiting. My chest tightened as I realized this wasn't some heat-of-the-moment cruelty. He had planned this. Days, maybe weeks. He didn't even care where I would go. He set the suitcase down by the door, his eyes still avoiding mine, and said nothing else. Just turned his back as if I were a stranger cluttering his hallway. The slam of the door echoed louder than thunder. My suitcase slipped from my hand, hitting the wet ground. The rain blurred everything until I couldn't tell if I was soaked from the storm or from my own tears. That was the night I stopped being his wife, and the night something in me refused to die. Before I continue, let me pause for a moment. Stories like this, betrayal, heartbreak, survival, they aren't just mine. They're universal. Almost everyone at some point has been underestimated, discarded, or made to feel like they weren't enough. And that's why I want to hear from you. Before I continue, subscribe and let me know, where in the world are you watching this from? I love hearing your stories too, because sometimes when we share where we come from, it reminds us that pain doesn't just belong to one person. It connects us all. Now, let me take you back. Back to who I really was before the rain, before the word parasite branded itself into me. Before Adrian, I had a steady life. Not fancy, not glamorous, but steady. I was always good with numbers, budgets, accounts, little details that most people overlooked. I thrived in them. My first job was at a small logistics company. Nothing special, but I liked the routine, the quiet satisfaction of balancing books that didn't add up until I touched them. My boss used to joke that if money had a language, I was fluent in it. I wasn't rich, but I had savings. I rented my own tiny apartment, bought my groceries, and once in a while treated myself to a new dress or a weekend trip. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Then I met Adrian. It's strange. When people ask how you fall in love, you want to give them a big story, a movie moment. But for me, it was just a smile. He was broke. I knew that from the start. He was chasing a big dream, though half the time he couldn't explain what that dream was without going in circles. But he had charm. He had this way of looking at you like you were the only person in the room. He made me feel seen, and back then, that was enough. I remember our early dates, cheap takeout on park benches, long walks where he painted a future in words so vivid I started to believe them myself. He said he wanted to build something that mattered, that he didn't want to live and die as just another man with a 9 to -5. And I believed in him. Or maybe I wanted to believe in us. Little by little, I started making sacrifices. At first, it was small things, helping him with his messy spreadsheets, paying for dinner when his funds were tight. Then it grew. I lent him money for his first business license. I worked double shifts while he pitched to investors. I gave up the promotion I was offered at work because he needed me more. After we got married, I left that job entirely. I told myself it was because Adrian's dream was our dream, and couples were supposed to build together. So I became his partner in more ways than one, running errands, crunching numbers, holding him when deals fell through, reminding him of his worth when rejection after rejection crushed him. When he couldn't afford rent, I sold my jewelry. When he was drowning in debt from a bad gamble, I picked up night shifts at a bakery. There were days my hands blistered from kneading dough, nights I came home so tired I fell asleep in my work clothes. But every sacrifice felt like proof of my devotion, proof that I believed in him. And then, one day, success came, not all at once, but slowly, like a tide rising higher and higher. His deals started landing. Money trickled in, then poured. Suddenly, we weren't scraping for rent. We were hosting dinners in restaurants with linen tablecloths. I should have been happy. In some ways I was. But Adrian began to change. It was small. He'd come home late, brushing off my questions with a quick "you wouldn't understand the business world." He started taking calls at odd hours, his voice low in the other room. I noticed Cassandra's name pop up on his phone once, twice, then more. He told me she was just a colleague. I wanted to believe him. I forced myself to believe him. Then came the parties. He'd invite investors, clients, important people to our place. I'd stand there, smiling, serving drinks, keeping the food trays full. And every now and then, I'd hear him laughing with his new friends, mocking my little side hustle, my small consultancy jobs I'd picked up just to feel useful again. "She thinks she's a businesswoman," he'd say with a smirk, and they'd all laugh. My cheeks would burn, but I swallowed it down. I told myself it was just nerves, that he didn't mean it, that he was under stress. But it didn't stop. The late nights became more frequent, the excuses thinner until they totally stopped coming. The distance between us grew so wide I spent days in a row without seeing him. And yet, I stayed, because every time I thought about leaving, I remembered all I had given up for him. All the pieces of myself I had already carved away. What would I be without him? That was the question that haunted me. I'd look at myself in the mirror, eyes tired, hands rough from work, clothes worn thin, and I'd hear his laughter in my head, the way he dismissed me, the way Cassandra's name lit up his screen at midnight. And a small, dangerous part of me started to wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe I really wasn't enough. Maybe I was just a parasite, clinging to him while he soared. And then the final straw. He came home with his mistress, Cassandra, and threw me out in the rain for being a parasite. That completely broke me, because deep down I knew the truth. I had given up everything I was to build him. And the man I thought I was building with, the one who once swore he couldn't breathe without me, had turned into someone I barely recognized. And the worst part, I couldn't tell where his lies ended and where my excuses began. The days after Adrian threw me out blurred together. I landed on a friend's couch, the kind of friend who didn't ask too many questions because she could already see the answers in my swollen eyes. Nights were the worst. I'd stare at the ceiling, hearing his words over and over, reminding me how useless I was. Maybe he was right. Maybe without him I was nothing. I cried into secondhand pillows, curled beneath thin blankets, slept on an empty stomach, wondering if I'd wasted the best years of my life on a man who never saw me. I barely ate, barely spoke. The world felt empty without him, and I wanted to end it all. But one morning, I decided to stop feeling sorry for myself, and I forced myself outside. I wandered aimlessly through the city when I stopped in front of it, a tall glass building that gleamed under the sun. For a moment, I saw myself in that reflection, not the broken wife Adrian discarded, but a woman who still had something left inside her. Something clicked. I had been many things in my life, a wife, a caretaker, a shield for Adrian's failures. But before all that, I had been good with numbers. I was sharp, skilled, and respected. That talent hadn't died just because my marriage had, and if he thought I was a parasite, then fine. I would prove him wrong in the only language men like him understood, success. That day, standing before that glass building, I made a decision. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to disappear. I was going to fight my way back, not with his name, not with his help, but with my own mind. And I would never let anyone call me a parasite again. But it wasn't as easy as I expected, especially after being away from the system for so long. Starting over is never as romantic as it sounds. The first thing I did was walk into a bank. My palms were sweaty, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the manager could hear it. I sat across from him, my resume in one hand, my broken pride in the other. I want to start a consultancy, I told him. Numbers, accounts, financial planning. It's what I'm good at. I can make it work. He looked at me with pity, and I could already hear his answer. His gaze slid from my scuffed shoes to my second-hand blouse, and I could almost hear Adrian's voice echo in the back of my mind. Parasite. We can't take risks on unstable situations, the manager said, as if I were a bad investment. He started stacking his papers, ready to dismiss me. But desperation has a way of sharpening your tongue. Give me one client, I said, leaning forward. One. No upfront loan, no large investment. Just let me prove I can turn numbers into profit. If I fail, you'll never have to see me again. But if I succeed, I'll bring more clients through your doors than you can imagine. He paused. My voice didn't shake, though my hands did under the desk. And maybe that conviction was enough, because against his better judgment, he agreed. That was my beginning. The first client was a small business owner, drowning in debt. I spent nights at the kitchen table of my friend's apartment, surrounded by scraps of paper, coffee rings staining my notes. My eyes burned. My back ached, but I kept going. Numbers didn't lie. And slowly, I turned chaos into clarity, showing him a way to restructure and save his business. But when I sent the invoice, I was met with silence. Weeks passed. I had risked everything for that project, and he didn't want to pay. The old Lydia, the one who hid behind her husband and swallowed her anger, would have cried quietly. This Lydia? She marched into his office, slammed the report down on his desk, and said, If you think my work is worth nothing, then explain why your business is finally out of the red. His cheeks flushed. His staff looked up. He paid me before I walked out the door. Those early days were brutal, nights of tears, days of hustle. My body begged for rest, but my mind wouldn't let me stop. I worked out of borrowed spaces, scribbled notes on napkins in cafes, pitched myself to people who barely gave me a second glance. For every door that opened, 10 slammed in my face. But each small victory tasted like survival. 1 client turned into 3. 3 turned into 6. My name began to travel, whispered in small business circles. She's relentless, they said. She knows what she's doing. I wasn't rich, not yet, but for the first time in years, I was more than a shadow in someone else's dream. Meanwhile, Adrian and Cassandra were living theirs. I'd see them sometimes, drifting through downtown like royalty. Cassandra, expensive clothes, Adrian behind the wheel of a flashy car he hadn't earned. They'd laugh loudly in restaurants where the cheapest dish cost more than my weekly groceries. It burned, seeing them. Every sighting was a blade to the ribs, because while I was scraping by, they looked untouchable, living their best lives. But money that isn't earned has a way of slipping through fingers. I didn't know it then, but beneath the shine, their foundation was cracking. My foundation, however, was slowly being built brick by brick as months passed by. I moved from a borrowed desk to a tiny rented office. I hired an assistant, a college student with the same fire in her eyes I once had. Together, we chased down clients, polished reports, built systems, and for the first time, I stopped waking up afraid of bills. I still cried some nights. Loneliness has a cruel way of sneaking in when you're alone. But in the morning, I would rise, paint on determination like armor, and keep going. Because every number I crunched, every account I balanced, was a step further from the woman Adrian called a parasite. Then came the day I walked past a mirror in a lobby of a client's building. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. My clothes weren't new, but they were neat. My hair wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And my eyes didn't look broken anymore. That was when I realized I was no longer surviving. I was growing. Adrian and Cassandra, they were still laughing in restaurants, but I knew sooner or later that laughter would falter. Because while they were spending, I was building. While they were mocking, I was rising. While they were living like the world owed them everything, I was learning that the world owes you nothing, and you take what you deserve. And that difference would change everything. I didn't think I would ever run into them again until one Thursday afternoon. I had just come out of a meeting, clutching a thin folder of contracts. My feet ached from the cheap heels I wore, but my spirit was light. I had secured a small but steady client, one that meant I wouldn't have to borrow rent money this month. For me, that was a victory. And then I heard it, the sharp purr of an engine. A sleek car slid into view, polished so bright the sunlight bounced off it like a spotlight. Inside, Adrian leaned back with one hand on the wheel. Cassandra draped over him and flashed a huge diamond ring sitting on her finger, laughing loudly. I froze. The crowd on the sidewalk seemed apart just enough for our eyes to lock. His lips curved, not in surprise, but in recognition, like he had been waiting for this moment. "Well, well," Adrian drawled, rolling the window down. His voice carried, sharp as a knife. "If it isn't Lydia, still wandering the streets with your papers and your pity work?" The people around us turned, strangers, businessmen, passers-by. Suddenly I was on a stage I had never asked for. Cassandra tilted her head, smirk painted perfectly across her lips. "Thank God you left her. She looks like she's begging for scraps," she murmured loudly enough for the bystanders to hear. "How fitting?" Adrian chuckled. "Don't worry, Lydia. Some people are made to build empires. Others are made to sweep the floors. At least you finally found your place." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not everyone laughed, but enough. Enough to make my chest cave in, my breath stumble, my vision blur. Their words dug into me, layer after layer, until I felt stripped bare on that street corner. The folder in my hand suddenly felt heavy, and just like that, I was back to that dreadful night months ago. My knees wobbled. All I wanted was to run, to disappear forever. For a second, I almost gave in, almost believed them, because maybe they were right. Maybe I had been fooling myself, fighting a battle I was destined to lose. Who was I to think I could build something when the man I once sacrificed everything for now mocked me like I was trash? The light turned green. Adrian revved the engine, sending one last smirk my way before the car roared off, leaving exhaust in my face and laughter echoing in my ears. I stood there long after they were gone, the city moving around me as if I didn't exist. The contracts slipped from my fingers, scattering across the sidewalk. People stepped over them, uncaring, just like they had stepped over me. I wanted to cry, to curl into myself, to give up this charade of strength and ambition. What was the point of building if the world only saw me as less? My reflection caught me again, in the glass window of the building beside me. A pale, shaken woman with hollow eyes stared back. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. That was my rock bottom. Shame, rage, heartbreak, all of it churned until I thought it might consume me whole. And then, under it all, I saw the fire in my eyes. Because as much as it hurt, as much as I wanted to give up, I realized something. Every insult, every humiliation, every laugh they threw at me was fuel. They wanted me crushed, erased, forgotten. But if I surrendered now, then Adrian's words would become truth. And I refused to let that happen. Not anymore. That night I couldn't sleep. The humiliation replayed in my head like a cruel song, his laughter, Cassandra's smirk, the whispers of strangers. Each time I closed my eyes, the words parasite and beggar stabbed deeper. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I pulled out my ledgers. Page after page, I traced the numbers I had scribbled over the months, earnings, expenses, projections. At first, I had kept these books simply to survive, to remind myself that I could still control something, even when my world had fallen apart. But as I read them again, I realized I could be more. Not just to make enough for survival, but I could build an empire. For the first time, I saw myself clearly, not as the desperate woman Adrian mocked, but as the strategist behind an expanding game. I had gone from zero to stability in less than a year. What if I pushed harder? What if I stopped thinking like a beggar asking for scraps and started thinking like a builder, an investor, a leader? The thought lit me up from the inside. I began calling old contacts, the ones I had once introduced to Adrian but who had dismissed me as just his wife. This time, they listened. I invested small amounts, partnered with people willing to take chances. Every deal was careful, calculated, and with each risk that paid off, my confidence grew. 2 years later, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building an empire brick by brick, ledger by ledger. And though I didn't know it then, a deal was coming. A property so undervalued, so perfectly placed, that it would change everything. The same deal that would lead me straight back into Adrian's world, but this time on my terms. The file landed on my desk on an ordinary Tuesday. At first, it looked like any other opportunity. An undervalued property in the heart of downtown, potential for redevelopment, neglected by careless owners. But when I scanned the address, my breath hitched. I read it again and again. It was their building. The one where Adrian and Cassandra lived in their marble and glass apartment, parading through the lobby like royalty. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the paper. Fate had a wicked sense of humor. Out of every building in the city, this was the one presented to me. I felt the old wounds rise, his voice calling me a parasite, her smirk as she watched him throw me onto the street. I remembered the rain, the suitcase already packed, the way I had crumbled. Not anymore. I signed the deal and paid in cash with no hesitation. Within weeks, the papers were finalized and the keys were mine. I was no longer just a consultant clawing my way upward. I was a property owner, and the landlord of the man who had once discarded me like trash. The first confrontation came quickly. I walked into the building lobby one morning, heels clicking on the polished floor that was now mine. Tenants bustled past, some carrying coffee, some chatting on phones, none aware that the woman they ignored was now the owner of their world. Then I saw them. Adrian and Cassandra side by side near the elevators. She was dripping in labels, heels that could pay someone's rent, a bag worth more than my first year's salary. He was in a tailored suit that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion in his eyes. When he turned and saw me, the color drained from his face. "Lydia?" he stammered. What are you doing here?" Cassandra's head whipped around, her smirk already curling. "Oh, look. It's the parasite. I didn't flinch, not this time." "Oh, didn't you hear?" I said smoothly, pulling a folder from my bag and placing it on the receptionist's desk. "I own this building now." The silence that followed was delicious. The receptionist blinked. The tenants nearby slowed their steps. Adrian's jaw opened and closed like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Cassandra broke first, her laugh sharp and shrill. "You own this? Don't make me laugh. You couldn't afford a decent pair of shoes when you were with him." I tilted my head, letting her words slide past like they were nothing. Then I handed the receptionist the official contracts. "Effective immediately," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the lobby. "The rent is increasing. Triple—" Gasps rippled through the room. Adrian's face flushed red. "You can't do that," he burst out, his voice echoing off the marble. "This is extortion. Oh, but I can." I stepped closer, just enough that only he could hear my next words. "You called me a parasite, Adrian, but parasites don't buy buildings. Parasites don't survive being thrown into the rain with nothing. You'll learn that the hard way." Cassandra's composure cracked. "Triple rent?" she screeched. "That's absurd. We have rights. Do you know who we are?" I smiled, calm and sharp. "Yes, your tenants." For the first time, the smirk vanished from her face. Adrian tried to rally, his voice rising. "You think this makes you powerful? You think sleeping around and owning some property means you've won? You'll never—" But the words faltered. He could see it. In my posture, my steady gaze, the weight of the contract signed in my name. He could feel it, the shift of control, the humiliation of being trapped in the very building he once paraded me out of. And I felt none of the shaking, none of the shame, none of the brokenness that had defined me before. I felt victorious. As I turned to leave, heels striking against my polished floor, I realized what this moment meant. The woman he once called a parasite now owned the very roof over his head. And with every rent check he wrote, every bill Cassandra complained about, every sleepless night they spent worrying about money, Adrian would be forced to remember that the parasite had become the predator, and I was not finished yet. Within weeks, whispers floated through the building like smoke. Cassandra was seen storming through the lobby in designer heels, her voice cutting across the marble as she demanded special treatment. She threatened lawsuits, threw tantrums at the receptionist, and once even hurled her overpriced handbag against the wall when she learned that, yes, she would be expected to pay the new rent like everyone else. Adrian was quieter, though not less pathetic. His once proud stride dulled into something smaller. He carried himself with a kind of beaten caution, as though every step weighed more than the last. Tenants whispered about how he had to sell his flashy car, how Cassandra's shopping trips had slowed, how the couple that once looked untouchable now looked fragile. Meanwhile, the building thrived. I poured myself into it, overseeing renovations floor by floor. Fresh paint, upgraded elevators, secure entry systems. Businesses began renting out office suites, drawn by the building's new reputation. Families moved into apartments once left shabby and forgotten, marveling at the improvements. For the first time, the building pulsed with life, and with each upgrade, with each new tenant smiling at me in the halls, I felt something heal inside of me. The parasite was gone. In her place stood someone formidable. Then one night, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer when I saw his name, but curiosity won. "Lydia," Adrian's voice cracked on the other end, raw and desperate like he had been crying. "Please, you have to listen." I stayed silent. "Cassandra's gone," he rushed on, his words tumbling over themselves. "She couldn't take it. The rent, the stress. She left me. I can't keep up anymore. The payments, the bills. Lydia, please, just give me more time." His breathing was ragged, unsteady. For a second, it almost transported me back to the man I once loved, back to the boy with dreams bigger than his pockets, back to the promises whispered after nights of lovemaking. But then I remembered everything he had done. I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch until he whispered, "Broken, please. I know you still love me. We can make this work. Couples fight all the time. We don't have to throw away everything we shared." I almost laughed at his audacity. And then I spoke, my voice calm and steady. "I'm not your savior anymore, Adrian." He choked on a sound I couldn't quite place, half sob, half disbelief. "I was never your parasite." My voice dropped, sharp and certain. "You were mine." Before he could respond, I ended the call. When I set the phone down, I didn't shake. I didn't cry. I didn't crumble the way I once had. Instead, I stood at my office window, staring out at the city lights glittering against the night sky. Somewhere below, Adrian lived in the building I owned, scraping together rent for an apartment he could barely afford. Somewhere, Cassandra scoured for her next victim. And me? I was no longer surviving. I was thriving. The world would never know the nights I cried into threadbare pillows, the mornings I dragged myself into meetings on no sleep, the days I pushed forward when giving up felt easier. But I knew, and that was enough. Sometimes revenge doesn't come in fire or fury. Sometimes it comes in success, quiet, calculated, undeniable. And as I pressed my palm against the glass, I smiled. Because Adrian had been right about one thing, the woman he once loved no longer existed. She had died the night he called her a parasite. But in her place, someone far more dangerous had been born. Looking back, I realize now that pain has two choices. It can bury you, or it can build you. When Adrian called me a parasite, I almost let his words become my truth. I almost accepted that my sacrifices, my loyalty, and my love meant nothing. But the truth is, betrayal can be fuel. It can light a fire you didn't know you had, pushing you to become stronger than you ever imagined. I didn't need to scream for revenge or destroy him with scandal. I didn't need to beg the world to see my worth. All I had to do was rise and keep rising until my success spoke louder than his cruelty ever could. The sweetest revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's walking past the person who once crushed you, knowing they'll never stand taller than you again. And for me, the closure wasn't in watching Adrian fall. It was in watching myself soar. Because the night I was thrown out as a parasite was the same night I was reborn as something far more dangerous, a woman who refused to be broken. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Lydia's shoes? Would you have made Adrian pay, or would you have walked away? And tell me, have you ever been underestimated only to prove everyone wrong? Share your experience in the comments. Your stories inspire more than you realize. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that pain can turn into power. More stories are coming your way, and trust me, you don't want to miss them.